Hello everyone, welcome back. In this video, we will try to understand one more fundamental concept which every software engineer, everyone who is aspiring to get into the IT industry must know. Wherein we understand the different major components of computer, in other words, important memory units of computer. What are they? How they are organized and how important they are. To start with, as we have understood, which is the most important component in your computer because of which everything happens is nothing but your processor. You can call it as microprocessor or you can call it as CPU, which is brain of your computer, which I would be representing in this style. This is my CPU. Fine, which happens to be one of the most important component in your computer. I would be representing this in this style. You can call it as CPU, you can call it as microprocessor, which is of which technology if you ask me, it is of one technology called as semiconductor technology. Of course, we have discussed something fundamental about this semiconductor technology in the last video, but now one more thing you must know about this technology is it is very fast in its nature. Very fast all the things it can execute. Now this important component is there to process your instructions, to process your data very fast and give you the desired output or give you the desired result. Now where to keep that data? You cannot keep somewhere, right? You cannot keep in air and then give it to processor. We need something on our machine, on our computer, wherein we can keep our instructions and data. That data then we will pass it to the processor and that processor can process that and gives us the desired result. Now where to keep it? That was the challenge. That is when it was 1950s almost. Top companies started to do some research on this. They tried to work on this and one of the company back then was IBM. And other companies were also involved to do this activity. They came up with one device. Which is that device if you ask me? That device is nothing but your hard disk. You can call it as hard disk device, which I would be representing in this style. I can call this as my hard disk drive. You can call it as hard disk. Fine. Wherein if you have some data, if you have some instructions, data, application, which you want to be processed and executed by CPU, you have kept it. And they were able to manufacture this particular device. Now, whatever data you have, which you want your processor to execute, it is currently residing in hard disk. And if you want this to be executed by this processor, then you have to send this data to this processor. How do we send it? That is when the concept of bus comes into picture. Bus means it's set of wires. Simply you can call it as a set of wires which carries information from one unit to the another unit, which carries information from one unit to the another unit within the system. Now this data which you have stored on hard disk, if you want that to be executed by this processor, then you have to pass this data to processor, for which you have connected these two devices within your computer using the concept of or using set of wires, which technically can be called as bus. Now all these instructions are slowly going to the processor. Hard disk is sending this, processor is able to get it. The moment it reaches to processor, within no time processor used to execute and give the result. Again, this hard disk used to send these instructions slowly, very slowly. And the moment it reaches to CPU or your processor, within no time it used to execute and give you the result. I am stressing one word here, slowly. This hard disk by nature compared to processor is very slow because it is of one technology called as electromechanical technology. Also to manufacture this hard disk, somewhere magnetic technology is involved. Magnetic technology is involved. Whichever device is of magnetic technology compared to semiconductor technology, they are relatively slow. Slow in the sense I am not talking that it's very slow, but if you compare with the speed of semiconductor technology, of course, this particular hard disk is slow in its nature. Because of the nature of hard disk, it used to send the instructions slowly. And because of the nature of processor, it used to execute the result and give you the desired output. It used to process your request and give you the desired output. In other words, there was speed mismatch between two important components within a system. Whenever within a computer, within any system, if there are some important memory units and if there is any speed mismatch, the entire efficiency of your computer will go down. It is like to a Ferrari engine, you are attaching the bullock cart wheels. Now to a Ferrari engine, if you could attach the bullock cart wheels, will you able to go in a speed which Ferrari is capable of? Of course not. Something same was happening here also. This processor is very, very fast in its nature and this hard disk is very, very slow in its nature. Of course, the major disadvantages which are involved here is, first of all, it is very bulky. Second, it is slow compared to the other important memory units. Also, it is noisy. And one of the major disadvantages associated with this memory unit happens to be that it is very, very slow in its nature compared to the other important memory unit. That is when they realize what to do. Our efficiency of our computer is going down because of this. After a lot of research, almost a decade of research, it was manufactured, it was invented in 1950s. Almost 1960s, after the decade of the research, almost in middle of 1960s, they came up with such a device which can match the speed of your processor. And this device I would be representing in this style, and I would call this device as random access memory, or you can call it as RAM. Now all the instructions which they were supposed to write on the hard disk, they started to write that on the RAM. All the data they started to keep on the RAM. And they connected this RAM to this processor through the set of wires, or you can call it as bus. And can you guess what technology they might have used to manufacture this, to invent this? Of course, if you want to match the speed of CPU, it should also be the same technology that of your CPU is manufactured, which is none other than semiconductor technology. And what is one of the major advantages of this technology? It is very, very fast in its nature. The major advantages which are associated with this memory unit is very fast. Compared to the size, it is very compact. It is not as bulky as your hard disk. It is less noisy. These were the advantages, and all the instructions they have kept on the RAM, and RAM is sending the instructions very, very fast to the CPU, and within no time your processor used to process the data and give you the result. Again, your processor need not to wait for the second instructions because RAM is sending it very, very fast and processor is executing very, very fast. In other words, there was no speed mismatch. The speed was matching as both of them are from the same technology, but not very fast. Soon they realized that there is a biggest disadvantage associated with this RAM. What is that, if you ask me? The biggest disadvantage which is associated here is it is a volatile device. What do you mean by volatile device? Something hi-fi what you're using. Volatile means such a device that if you want it to work, then continuous power supply has to be given. For a fraction of second, if power gone, all the data which you have stored on the RAM will be vanished. Maybe you have given the power supply. One day, 2 days, you have written a lot of applications, lot of coding has been done. Lakhs and crores of lines of coding has done. Lot of data you have kept it here. For a fraction of millisecond, power is gone. All the data which you have written here will be vanished. Do you think there is a major disadvantage here? Not just that, it is expensive comparatively to other storing memory unit which can store data. It is volatile also, it is expensive also. Now what to do? This is somewhat okay, you can manage, but what will you do with this volatile? If fraction of seconds power gone, the data is gone. That is when they realize all the things are not bad on hard disk. There are some advantages also which is associated with this hard disk. The first and the major advantage is it is a non-volatile device. It is less costly, it is cheap, it is inexpensive compared to the RAM. But the major thing is it is non-volatile. That means if you want to keep some data on your hard disk, continuous power supply is not required. If you have kept some data on hard disk, if you take out the power, still after months and years, if you try to open the hard disk and check the data, it will be stored as it is. There is no demand of continuous power supply to store any data or information on hard disk. That is one of the major advantages which is associated with the hard disk. That is the reason they thought, let's connect this RAM and hard disk. Now they connected back. Now this time they are connecting RAM and hard disk, not the processor. They connected back this RAM and hard disk. Now whatever instructions you are writing on the RAM, whatever you are writing on your machine, be it mobile phone, laptop or your desktop, whatever instructions you are writing on the RAM. From the RAM, very fast it is going to the processor and processor is giving you the result within no time. You are able to write H immediately on your screen, you are able to see that because you are writing on the RAM. RAM is sending the instruction to processor very fast and processor is executing. Immediately you are able to see that back. But whatever data you are writing on your RAM, if you want that data to be there on your system, to be there on your computer for a longer time, forever, then you have to get that data from your RAM onto the hard disk. The process of storing data from RAM to the hard disk permanently, this process we call it as saving. What we call it as saving. Fine. Now whatever data you have saved on your hard disk, it is there very safely on the hard disk. If you want that to be executed, now who is the one who executes everything? It is the processor. Now tell me, is your hard disk and processor, are they directly connected with each other? The answer is no, they are not directly connected. In between, we have a RAM. The process of getting the data from the hard disk onto the RAM so that it can further be executed, that process technically we call it as loading. What we call it as loading, in order to execute that. I hope now you are able to connect the dots, the meaning of saving, loading. Whenever you meet a new friend in your new company or in your college, you'll ask them to give the number. You'll share the numbers with each other, contacts. You will typing the number. Don't save it, just type it. Switch off your phone. That means power supply is gone from your phone. Again switch on your phone. Will you be able to see that number again? No. Why? Because you're writing on the RAM. And RAM is sending the instruction to the processor and you're able to see the number. You're typing 9, you're able to see. 99, you're able to see from your eyes. Because RAM and processor is communicating very, very fast. But if you switch off your phone, and again that means power supply is gone from your computer. Again if you switch on, will you be able to see that number? No. If you want that number to be there on your phone, on your device, on your machine permanently, what you will do? You will save it. That means getting that copy of data from the RAM onto the hard disk in order to store that permanently. That is only we call it as saving. I hope you are able to realize that. And then if you have something on the hard disk, if you want that to be executed, you have to get that to the RAM, because RAM is the one who is directly in connection with the processor if you want to process any of the data or if you want to execute any of the instructions. Then the process of getting that data from your hard disk onto the RAM for the further execution is only called as loading. You might have seen in your childhood, if you have kept some of the movies on your laptop or a computer, if it is there permanently, that means that is there on the hard disk. If you click it slightly, you will see loading for a fraction of seconds. Of course, these days we have better versions. Hard disks are also being manufactured a little fast, but at least you are in the era where you have seen this, you have experienced this loading. Why? Because the nature of hard disk is little slow compared to RAM. That loading, that means getting that video onto the RAM, and once it is on the RAM, without any stop, without any flaw, continuously you're able to play the music, continuously non-stop you're able to watch that video or a movie which you had stored in your computer, because RAM is sending the instructions very fast to your CPU or processor, and processor is able to execute that. That slightly loading means that is being loaded from your hard disk to the RAM, and from the RAM only the instructions is being sent to the processor and you're able to get the result. I hope now you're able to connect the dots there. Anything if you want to execute in your mobile phone, in your computer or laptop, where that has to be loaded? That has to be loaded onto the RAM only. From the RAM only it will be executed. Instructions will be given to the processor, and processor will be able to process your data or instructions and give you the desired result. Now I hope you are able to understand that. Something if you want to store permanently on your device, where you will be storing that? Onto the hard disk. Now the storage area on the hard disk where you are storing, technically we call that storage area as file. The storage area on your RAM wherein you are storing the data, technically we call that as byte. And the small space where you are executing your information, the small unit on your processor also, of course it cannot store something, but to process your data, to process your instructions, some space is required, right? And that space we call it as register. So only we say CPU is faster than RAM, RAM is faster than the hard disk. And also remember, whenever we utter the term file from now on, you should come to a conclusion I am referring to hard disk. Whenever I hear anyone refer the term byte, you should come to a conclusion that they are referring to RAM. And if someone utters the term called as register, they are referring to CPU or they are referring to the processor. Now tell me, which is the memory unit which is directly connected with your processor? It is the RAM. Hence, for RAM we also call it as main memory. We call it as main memory because don't you think every instruction has to come to the RAM? From there only it has to go to the CPU. That is the reason we call it as RAM is a main memory. Wherein this hard disk we also call it as a secondary memory unit. Secondary memory, which is not directly connected with your processor. It is just there to store your data or information permanently. I hope now you are able to come to a conclusion and connect the dots which you have it. And also you might know that the more is the speed of RAM, the more faster computer gets. Why? Because anything if you want to execute, don't you think that has to come to the RAM only? And if you are opening at a time multiple applications, if that has to reach to the CPU, first where they will come? If it is there on your computer, that means they are there on hard disk. If you are opening it, that will come to the RAM. At a time, if multiple applications comes to RAM, if the RAM size is very, very small, then what happens in that case? In that case, your phone, your system will hang because it is beyond the capacity of RAM. That is the reason we say the more is the capacity of the RAM, the more fast your computer is. I hope now you are able to understand these things. Also, you might have heard of one more small memory device which you must know, which I can call it as maybe cache. which is even more closer to your CPU. Now, what will be stored in this? The size will be very small, depends. It could be of kilobytes or it could be in some MBs also. Maybe 20 or 30 MB. It will not be in GB. This cache memories may be in some kilobytes or bytes. What will be stored here? Will I be able to store anything here? No. That will be completely decided by your operating system. Whenever, if you're opening any of the file again and again, there is image, maybe you're opening again and again. If there is any file which you're using again and again, what will happen in that case? That will be automatically stored in the cache memory. And from there, CPU will take these instructions rather than taking from the RAM. RAM will be of more size. Sometimes it could be of 8 GB, 8 gigabytes, 16 gigabytes. I hope you are able to understand. Gigabytes. But here it is in the form of kilobytes and megabytes, MBs and KBs. Fine. If I just ask you, to search maybe a small pin in somewhere in the big hall or big living room where so many things are there, you'll face difficult to find that. If I just give you a small, maybe a table, and if you ask me, please search if there is a small pin there, will you be able to search easily? Yes. And that is one of the advantages of the cache. The memory, the space is very, very small. And for CPU, it is easy to get the instructions or to find the instructions on the cache memory easy comparatively to the RAM. So whenever there is a frequently requested data, sometimes there is the same file, same application, same image, you are frequently requesting, that means you are frequently opening it. In that case, OS will allocate that and store on the cache memory. Next time if you open it, processor will not take that from the RAM. RAM, so much of space is there. To find it, it might be difficult, but cache, very less space is there, very small it is. Your processor will be able to find the data from the cache memory easily comparatively to the RAM. That is the reason we have here. From the RAM, it will be loaded here. Frequently requested data. Again and again, the data which you are requesting, which you are executing, that will be automatically stored here. And the processor will take that again and your system will become even more faster. But usually we say it is the RAM, all your applications will be loaded onto the RAM, and from the RAM it will be given to the processor and your processor will be able to execute this. I hope now you are able to understand everything about this. Saving is the process of getting the data from the RAM onto the hard disk to store permanently. That is what we call it as saving. Loading means whatever permanent data we have on the hard disk, we are getting that onto the RAM so that we can execute it further. That process only we call it as loading. I hope now you are able to understand everything about these important memory units which are there in your computer and how they are organized. Thank you so much for joining me in this video. We'll meet again in the upcoming videos. Thank you so much.